Hi, and welcome back. We're looking in gender, looking at the women's movement, and I want you to know or remind you that with this there are three waves of the women's movement. And to also remind you that society shapes how we understand femininity and masculinity, as well as us being able to shape society and its view of gender, often through the way we communicate to one another. And this has implications on rights and rules and roles, and allows what the roles allow us to do and the expectations about men and women. Now, as I mentioned, there's three waves of the women's movement. And the first wave, it began in 1840 and continued on to 1925. And its main focus was on status and rights of women. Now, the second wave, well, this began in around 1963 and went on till about the mid-90s. And the focus were much more diverse. It was looking at things like equity, oppression of women, politically motivated movements. And then the third wave, well, this was from about the mid-90s onward. And the influence here was, well, the third wave was predominantly influenced by the second wave and what it had achieved. And it included looking at women of different ethnicities, looking at around disabilities and abilities, classes of women, appearances of women, laws, and looking at the sexual orientation and gender identity issues. So it was a rather broad area, which, as it may turn out, is part of what is weakening the third wave to some degree. Now remember, in your chapter it references rhetorical or rhetoric. Now rhetoric is just really about persuasive arguments or persuasive communication. And so rhetorical movements are collectives. Collectives are groups of people that use persuasive efforts that try to affect change in the existing attitudes, laws, and politics. Now, not all rhetorical arguments are based in fact, but strongest ones are. There have been multiple women's movements throughout time, throughout the years from 1840s onward. There's been a variety of them, and rhetorical movements are about gender are not very uniform. They have a lot of targets, if you will, and embrace a variety of ideas about gender and the pursuit of a range of variety of goals, and we'll look at some of those. But what we're going to try to do is narrow it down into two groups or two ideologies, two camps, if you will, categories of women's movements. The first will be liberal. And liberal feminism asserts that men and women are similar and should have equal rights, equal roles, and equal opportunities. Now, the cultural ideology, it's different insofar as that it argues that men and women are fundamentally different, and because of that, they should have their own unique rights, their own unique roles, and their own unique opportunities. So let's get started with this chapter, and I hope you enjoy it. There's a lot to be covered here, so let's see how we can manage it. Take your time, pace yourself, revisit the chapter, underline, read, and watch the videos, okay? Good luck, everybody. Here we go. How was the liberal ideology expressed? Well, the women's rights movement focused on enlarging women's political rights. Among other reforms, early feminists desired the right to vote in order to have a political change effect. They wanted to be involved in a manner that allowed them to have a role and a place in society. Now, in 1948, Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's right convention, and it was organized by Lucretia Coffin Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, Mott and Stanton and others wrote a keynote address, and it was called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled after the Declaration of Independence in support of the women's civil liberties And at the time, the convention had little effect on the mainstream politics. Now, although some African Americans were key players in the early first wave, tensions between white and black activists developed, particularly over whether to prioritize women's suffrage or African American male suffrage. Now, over time, the women's rights movement came to focus largely on issues concerning white women, whereas black women turned their efforts towards advancing the rights of African Americans. Black men received suffrage in 1870 with the passage of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. The right to vote could not be based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Black men won the right to vote. Women gained the right to vote in the U.S. on August 26, 1920. In Canada, women won the right to vote in Manitoba, beginning in Manitoba, on January 28, 1916. Instrumental in this occurring, in Canada at least, was the work of 5 women. They're known as the famous 5. The women were Emily Murphy, Irene Marriott Parlby, Nellie Mooney McClune, Louise Crombie McKinney, and Henrietta Muir Edwards. And they were instrumental in getting the vote in Canada as early as they did, and influencing the rest of Canada and the vote for women in Canada. Now, the cultural ideology, this is quite a bit different, as you can remember from earlier on. And the cultural ideology is demonstrated in the 1800s, but was known as the Cult of Domesticity. Now, the Cult of Domesticity asserts that men and women were fundamentally different. In fact, cultural feminists of the time believed that women's higher morality could help eliminate corruption associated with the political sphere if women had the right to vote. The Cult of Domesticity worked to end slavery, ban alcohol, and create child labor laws. Now, after the mid-1920s, the women's rights movements became fairly inactive, and for several decades, and for a number of reasons. Most significantly were the World War efforts, World War I and World War II. And at this particular point, this is where women started to enter the workforce in record numbers. And after the war, when the men returned home, well, women were fired and men took their jobs. Women ended up marrying, having 3 kids before the age of 30. Children left home by the time that she was 50, and the lack of opportunities outside the home and family awakened what is known as the second wave. All right, now let's look at the second wave of feminism. So remember, this is 1963 through to about 1995. And it included, we're going to look at in the second wave, the liberal feminisms, cultural feminists, and as you might expect, the anti-feminists. And to remind you that the liberal ideology is that men and women are fundamentally alike, and therefore should have equal rights and equal roles. So let's begin with the radical feminists. Now, you may not be familiar with radical feminism, but you might remember or have read about, back in the 60s, what is known as the Women's Liberation Movement. That is the beginning of the radical feminism. The Women's Liberation Movement originated in the new left of politics, which at that time in the 60s was protesting the Vietnam War and racial discrimination. So remember, this was the early 60s, and there was a lot of social change and protests done by young people on a variety of different issues during this era of time. And so this was a time of change, not just in North America, but around the world too. Many women withdrew from the New Left a little later on in protests ramped up on sexism. That's what they focused on, and they formed their own organizations. Now, part of what they would do is incorporate what they called consciousness-raising groups. These were also known as rap groups. Now, remember, we're in the 60s, so that made sense then, in which all the members had equal opportunity to speak, and because, and this became a really significant form of communication in radical feminism, this opportunity to share ideas, to talk openly, which helped women understand their individual experiences of inequity were related to larger structural oppression. Now, remember, I'm going to use the word structural quite a bit. Structure means these big parts of society: education, religion, politics, economy, family. These are structures. And when the feminists began to become aware of how these structures were influencing the impact of oppression on women, this is where they started to divide off, if you will, into groups that would advocate for different things, because they were focusing on the structures of society. Now, one very important outcome in radical feminism was the identification of the structural basis of a women's oppression. It wasn't just accidental, it was structural. And remember, patriarchy, a lot of society is based on this inequity between men and women, where patriarchy is the foundation of a lot of the structure. Radical feminists recognized how things worked in the culture and had what kind of effects that it had on women's individual situation. This is what gave rise to what was known at that time as personal is political. You know, women's individual lives, personal, had a political impact that each woman could have a role to play in the shift of politics, of social change. Now, one such movement encouraged women to reject the health care, not the system in and of itself entirely, but in terms of how well did doctors and the healthcare system understand women. You have to be aware that back in that time, and even into today's world, a lot of the research that's done on healthcare is done on men. And so when those, here are the symptoms for this, and here are the symptoms for that, and here's the medication you need for this, that, and the other, we're focused mostly on the outcomes as it related to men, not necessarily to women. For example, you may have heard where the early warning signs for a heart attack are pain down the left side and the like. Well, those are symptoms for men. The symptoms for women are subtly to almost dramatically different. And so women at this period, with the radical feminists, were looking at women to become more self-aware and better understand their own bodies. And so in 1970, they published a book called Our Bodies, Ourselves. And that has gone through many iterations and still is something you can find today. And it was an attempt for women to become more self-aware and put less control in the hands of men about their own bodies. And you still see that argument come through in today's women's movement. But due to the lack of the formal organizations of radical feminists, they weren't able to make the kind of changes they really were aiming for at a public level, at a governmental level, and in terms of these structures. So, however, they provided important critique of sexual identity in terms of feminism. And that's been really important in terms of the overall movements. Now, a second group, the liberal feminists, they developed around the same time as radical feminists, and they advocate for women's equality in all aspects of life. Now, liberal feminists, they were sparked by the publication by an author by the name of Betty Friedman. And she wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, and that was in 1963. And in the book, Friedman describes what she referred to as the problem that has no name. Now, what she was referring to was this general dissatisfaction and discontent that women experience due to their lack of opportunity outside the home. This lack of access was the result of structural and institutional inequalities in the United States and Canada. Now, you have to remember, this is 1960. There were The World War II had finished in around 1945, 48, in that area. So at that early time, when men went to war, women were doing the work that men used to do. And when the war was over and they started to come back, men returned to their jobs and women were back at home again. And so we'll look at this in a little bit later. This really created a great deal of, well, I saw what it was to work. I saw what it was to make money. I had opportunities. I was needed. I was valued. And now I'm back in the home and I'm not valued. I don't have these opportunities. And so this became the focus of a lot of the liberal feminism. The National Organization of Women, this is a group called NOW, N-O-W, is a liberal feminist organization, and it was founded in 1966, and it continues to work for women, women's politics, and work for women in professional lives and in their educational equality. Now, while liberal feminism did emerge out of the needs of the middle class, the movement has been more racially and socioeconomically diverse than is often given credit for being. Now, the liberal feminism is also confined to is not confined to the United States, as the liberal feminist movement has developed in response to oppression to women all over the world. Now, a third group, womanism, this was founded by a group of black women to show how race and gender intersect the oppression, in oppression of women of color. Now, wominists point out that black women, in comparison to white women, are more likely to be single, are more, have often got more children, and are paid less, and assume more of the financial responsibility for their families. Now, wominists also focused on how class intersects race and gender in women's lives, working to make social services more responsive to the needs of poor women and to improve job training and opportunity for more women of color, and to have more access to better paying jobs. Now, what they did in 1997 was to develop the Million Woman March, and this was a grassroots endeavor. They didn't have strong leadership, as a lot of the women movements haven't. They've been more democratic in their leadership. And it was a movement of, it was a march in support of African American women. Now, a fourth group is the multiracial feminists. And it was an ideological group. It builds on the focus on equity for black women by emphasizing multiple systems of domination. Again, another group that has really focused on these different elements of structure in society that contribute to oppression of women, whether they be white, black, or disabled, or class. So in this movement, race is especially important, but it's also intertwined with other systems of oppression. Now, there's another group that we could look at. It's known as the ecofeminists, and they argue that there's a connection between women's oppression and the desire to dominate nature. That ecofeminists believe that as long as oppression is culturally valued, it will be imposed on anyone, anything that cannot or will not resist it. Now, in this movement, all forms of oppression are linked, and feminism is about justice and ending all forms of oppression. Okay, we've sort of highlighted the liberal ideological feminist movements of the second wave. Let's begin and now look at the cultural ideology, where the foundation is that women and men are different in important ways and should therefore have different rights and roles. The first cultural group we'll explore are the separatisms, or the separatists. Now, unlike the separatists of Quebec of the 90s and in the 80s, they sought to provide communities for women to live independently of men. Now, separatists believe that women are fundamentally different from men, and in that they value harmony, they value peace, they value life, equality, and nurturances. And so it was better to be separate from men than to be among men. Since society is dominated by patriarchy and capitalism, separatists formed communities apart from the values typically associated with Western masculinity. They've been they have very little political influence because they choose to live outside the dominant political system. Alternatively, the Revelorism is a feminist movement focusing on heightened public awareness and the respect for women's contributions to society. So rather than sort of, they wanted to really emphasize what women do that is different from men and celebrate those differences, whether it be in terms of homemaking, raising children, or the tasks and activities that they might contribute in the home, the quality of the work that they do at home. They wanted that to be celebrated. Revelerists also desire to increase the value placed on women's traditional roles and skills. From standpoint theory, if you remember standpoint theory, it depends on where on this line you stand, will give you what perspective of society that you have. So from standpoint theory, Revelerists argue that women's traditional involvement in childcare and domestic responsibilities make for more nurturing, supportive, and cooperative than men. And they wanted that to be celebrated, recognized, and valued similarly to the skill sets that men bring to the table. So, as you might expect, there have been anti-feminism in the second wave. In the 1970s, Maribel Morgan, she launched what she called the Total Woman Movement. And Helen Anderlin, well, she formed the fascinating womanhood movement, and both of which advocated that women's return to traditional roles, values, and attitudes. They strongly supported that women should be in the home doing what it is that women do best and what makes them separate from men. The primary support for this return to the tradition came from women who were economically dependent on their husbands and who espoused these conservative values. More significantly, there was a group that was called Stop ERA back in the 70s, in particular around 72 and 73, and this is in the States. So it's important to make this distinction. Your textbook has a particularly American flavor, and I try to introduce a little bit of Canadian to this. But the Stop ERA movement was also developed in the 1970s. It was a movement that emerged in response to the 1972 and 1973 campaigns to ratify Equal Right Amendment, the ERA, and that's in the United States. The movement's major figures were Phyllis Schlafly, and she argued that feminism was destroying femininity and encouraging women to be more like men. So the Stop ERA movement was successful in blocking ratification of the amendment. It still hasn't been passed to this day in the United States. Now in Canada, our approach has been different. We've had an equal pay amendment that was put out in 1985 to try to bring women's pay up to men's pay for equal work. It hasn't achieved the kind of desired outcome that was planned. However, it is something that Canada has continued to work towards, and there has been some improvements, in particular women's access to what is known as STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math, is far greater than it ever has been. In fact, women approach those career choices at a far greater rate than men do. So it's having an impact. It just hasn't created what we would describe as equality. Now there's also what we would describe as the second wave of contemporary feminism. And we're going to look at two particular groups. One is Riot Girl and the other is Power Feminism. Riot Girl began as an underground movement in the 80s. And if you go, you can find a bunch of their stuff online still. They're still active. Founded out of the punk music and radical DIY politics and ethics movement. They use their music and e-zines are electronic magazines, to spread their perspective. They're looked at like they would be instrumental in, they've been considered instrumental in moving this second wave into the third wave because of how they communicate to a younger crowd and gets them engaged with music and publishings that they can identify with. Power feminism, on the other hand, is predicated on the belief that women's passive acceptance of discrimination and the identification that they make of themselves as victims is the reason for the discrimination and oppression. Women can stop oppression by using their own power to control what happens to them and how they identify themselves and their experiences. So power feminism was, some of what was noted was by Naomi Wolf, where she states a woman's own beliefs that they are victim is what holds them back from achieving equality. Power feminism appeals to white, successful, and well-educated women who already feel a certain degree of strength and power because of their position. It doesn't necessarily translate well into the lower class and less advantaged individual. It tends to be less helpful for those without the privilege, and emphasizes empowerment as influential in shaping the third wave. And so now we'll move into what includes or what's involved in the third wave of the feminist movement. Some groups of the second wave feminists are still active today. Simultaneously, a third wave of the feminist movement has become popular. Third wave feminism is less structured than the previous waves, and it's very diverse, including women of various races, sexualities, classes, and abilities and such. But there are some features of the third wave feminism that are worth noting. First is intersectionality. This is a third wave feminist recognize that women differ in terms of race, class, sexual orientation, body shape and sizes, ability and disabilities. They seek to figure out how to speak for women as a group while still recognizing these differences. They see oppression as intersectional, that is, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, everything should be addressed holistically. Secondly, coalition and alliances. Third wavers form relationships with other people and other groups that work against various forms of oppression. So this becomes an important feature of third wave feminism. Thirdly, everyday resistance. Third wave feminists believe that the changes second wave feminists fought for have not been effectively integrated into daily life. They seek to promote individual changes following the structural changes that have been made. They say that politics must come from embodied positions from one's everyday life. Fourthly, media savvy. Because of the era in which they were born, third wave feminists are immersed in media and use media to accomplish many of their goals. Consumerists. This is a component of all third wavers. However, some readily embrace girl culture, and they emphasize being sexy and feminine, which often involves a great deal of product consumption. Fourthly is individualism, and the focus on individual goals and strategies and identities are important to the third wave feminism. Some say that this means that the third wave will be unlikely to have widespread political success because there's not a unified set of goals for the movement. And then last, what we'll look at is another group that's been more current in more recent years in terms of a feminist movement, and it's known as the hip-hop movement feminism. It's another more contemporary movement involving black feminists who consider the post-civil rights and hip-hop generation. They see culture as a key place to challenge and to mobilize for political effect. From their early influences in civil rights movements in the 60s and the cultural depiction of black people in communities in the media, hip-hop feminism has been tackling these emerging issues, and it's been heard in many current artists who challenge misogyny, gender norms, and women's rights. So that's where we are on the women's movements. I hope you found this useful and informative, and we'll get moving on as we move through the semester. So keep up the good work, everybody. Bye now.